On Christmas evening 2003, the Matthews family set out for what should have been an ordinary holiday drive through Oregon's Columbia Gorge. Richard and Elaine Matthews packed their 3 children into the family's Ford Explorer, the back seat filled with chatter, candy wrappers, and wrapped gifts destined for relatives. At a Troutdale gas station, security footage captured them laughing, a father's hand resting on his wife's shoulder, 3 children bouncing with impatient energy. An hour later, a Hood River Cafe's grainy tape recorded the family's final known moments, a quick stop for hot chocolate before braving the freezing fog. Then, silence. Their headlights disappeared into the gorge, never to be seen again. For weeks, helicopters swept the icy river. Volunteers searched the cliffs. Divers scoured the waters. Nothing surfaced. No wreckage, no bodies, no trace of Christmas wrapping paper floating downstream. The gorge, locals whispered, had swallowed them whole. But 20 years later, the river gave up its secret. Divers pulled the Explorer from the depths, coated in mud, windows sealed. Inside were the skeletal remains of Elaine and the children, still buckled in their seats. One seat, however, was empty. The father's. And with that absence came a revelation no one was prepared to face.
Before we dive into this case, I just want to share something from my heart. I'm a 34-year-old woman working hard, all alone, to keep this channel alive. I believe Jesus gives strength to those who struggle. And today, I humbly ask for your support. If you love Jesus, please support me with just 1 like. It may seem small to you, but for me, it's a blessing that can keep me going. Now, back to the case.
The Christmas lights still glowed faintly in Portland neighborhoods on the evening of December 24, 2003, as Richard and Elaine Matthews bundled their 3 children into the family's dark green Ford Explorer. The plan was simple: drive east toward Hood River, make a stop for cocoa, and then arrive at Elaine's parents' home in time for midnight gifts. The city was dressed in holiday quiet, streets wet from drizzle, and a heavy fog already beginning to roll down from the Columbia Gorge. At 8:12 p.m., surveillance footage from a Troutdale gas station caught the family in fleeting, grainy images. Elaine leaned down to adjust her youngest child's scarf, the girl's pink mitten dangling from her sleeve. Richard swiped his credit card at the pump, glancing back at the car in a way that seemed protective, almost rehearsed. Inside the convenience store, their oldest son begged for a pack of gum. It was an ordinary family scene, the kind repeated in countless homes across Oregon that night. Yet for the Matthews, it would be the last time anyone saw them alive. Less than an hour later, a second recording surfaced, a grainy black and white tape from a Hood River Café. The Explorer pulled into the lot, headlights piercing through fog. Then the door swung open. Elaine ushered the kids inside, where they laughed over steaming cups of hot chocolate. Richard sat stiffly, his expression unreadable. Patrons remembered the family's cheerful noise, the clinking of mugs, the 3 children squabbling over marshmallows. At 9:03 p.m., they walked back into the cold night. The bell above the cafe door chimed once. The car's headlights turned east. And then, nothing. The gorge that night was a place of shadows. The road snaked along cliff sides where fog pressed against guardrails like a living thing. Truckers later recalled seeing 2 sets of headlights vanish into the mist. Searchers who would comb the stretch of highway in the days ahead described it as driving through a tunnel of silence. No moonlight, no sound but the hiss of water below. It was here, somewhere between Hood River and the Dalles, that the Matthews family disappeared. The cold open ends not with a discovery, but with an absence. No wreckage appeared in the river. No skid marks carved the asphalt. Neighbors awoke on Christmas morning expecting joy, only to hear rumors of a family swallowed by the gorge. Helicopters scoured the water. Volunteers walked the banks with flashlights. Still, nothing surfaced. Not a license plate, not a shoe, not a scrap of Christmas wrapping paper drifting downstream. The lingering image is an abandoned stretch of highway, fog curling around empty guardrails. The viewer is left with a chilling sense that the gorge has claimed another secret, that 5 lives dissolved into the night without a trace. What no one could imagine then was that the truth was darker than an accident. The empty driver's seat would, decades later, tell its own story, a story not of loss by nature's hand, but of betrayal by the person meant to protect them most.
The Matthews family was known in their Portland neighborhood as the kind of family people waved to from across the street. Richard, 42, worked as a mid-level manager at a lumber distribution company, while Elaine, 39, ran a home baking business that filled their cul-de-sac with the smell of cinnamon and fresh bread every morning. Their children, Mark, 11, Sarah, 8, and little Jacob, 5, were bright and spirited, forever riding their bikes around the block or drawing chalk games on the sidewalk. Christmas Eve for them wasn't just another holiday. It was tradition, ritual, a night marked with warmth and predictability. Each year, after a day of errands and preparations, the Matthews family would drive out east toward Hood River, where Elaine's parents lived in a 2-story home near the orchards. There, stockings waited on the mantel, and her father would put on Bing Crosby's records. For the children, the ride itself was part of the magic. The car filled with laughter, Elaine's red scarf draped casually around her shoulders, Richard's firm hand on the wheel. On December 24, 2003, it began no differently. The house smelled faintly of gingerbread. Elaine wrapped small gifts for her nieces, slipping them into a canvas bag, while Jacob trailed behind her, humming carols. Mark was already buzzing with anticipation, fiddling with his handheld video game. Sarah practiced tying a ribbon into a bow for her grandmother's present. By 7:45 p.m., Richard called out, "Everyone in the car!" Elaine's red scarf was the last thing she grabbed before shutting the front door. She looped it once around her neck, the long ends brushing her coat. It wasn't expensive, just wool slightly frayed at the edges, but it had been a gift from her mother years earlier, and Elaine wore it every holiday season. None of them knew that piece of fabric would later become the only tangible reminder of that night. At the Troutdale gas station, the family's energy was light, distracted, though Richard seemed preoccupied, though his children didn't notice. On camera, he kept his eyes lowered, avoiding the lens, while Elaine ushered Sarah and Jacob inside to buy snacks. To bystanders, it looked ordinary, almost mundane, a family on their way to celebrate. By the time they reached Hood River and stopped at the café, the fog had thickened. The children pressed their hands against the café window, watching condensation bead on the glass. Elaine adjusted her scarf while Richard ordered coffee, his jaw tight. Patrons remembered Elaine's laughter, her children's bickering, and Richard's silence. At 9:03 p.m., the Explorer's headlights cut through the mist as it pulled out of the lot. The car merged onto I-84 eastbound, swallowed almost instantly by the fog that clung to the gorge like a curtain. Truckers later recalled that night as treacherous, visibility reduced to a few feet, headlights appearing and vanishing without warning. Somewhere along that stretch of highway, something happened. Whether by accident or intention, the Explorer ceased to exist in the world of the living. Neighbors waiting the next morning assumed the Matthews had made it to Hood River safely. But at Elaine's parents' home, the night stretched into dawn without their arrival. Wrapped gifts remained unopened under the tree. Elaine's mother stood at the window, her heart tightening with each hour of silence. Days later, when searches were underway, volunteers found a single object tangled in roadside brush about 20 miles east of Hood River. A red wool scarf, damp from rain, the fringe torn. Elaine's scarf. It was the only thing recovered from the family's disappearance that could be held in someone's hands. The Explorer itself remained missing. Its passengers vanished as if swallowed by the gorge. The Matthews Christmas Eve outing had become something else entirely, the prologue to one of Oregon's most chilling, unsolved mysteries. On Christmas morning, 2003, the Matthews family's absence rang louder than any carol. Elaine's parents rose early in their Hood River home, the smell of coffee filling the air, stockings lined neatly on the mantel as they always were. By 7 a.m., Elaine's mother was standing at the window, brushing the curtain aside every few minutes, waiting for headlights to appear in the drive. But the drive remained empty. By 9 a.m., unease turned into alarm. Phone calls went unanswered. Elaine's father drove into town, scanning the snowy shoulders of the highway, hoping perhaps they'd had car trouble. At 10:45 a.m., when there was still no word, the family made the call that would set everything in motion. They reported Richard, Elaine, and the children missing. The response was immediate. Portland and Hood River authorities coordinated one of the largest holiday search efforts in the county's history. By noon, sheriff's deputies, state troopers, and local volunteers had mobilized. Helicopters cut through the winter sky, scanning the Columbia Gorge below. Rescue divers in dry suits plunged into the churning waters, dragged by currents that had claimed many lives before. Hundreds of volunteers lined the riverbanks, combing through brush and reeds. Boy Scout troops, off-duty firefighters, and neighbors carried flashlights, calling the children's names into the mist. Mark, Sarah, Jacob, echoed into silence. The most haunting image came that first day, a child's sneaker, wedged in the rocks near the riverbank, not far from a rest stop off I-84. The shoe was small, blue, and worn. Elaine's father confirmed it belonged to Sarah, his granddaughter. It was the first and only personal item authorities recovered that week. The discovery turned the search from hopeful to grim. If a child's shoe was by the water, did it mean the Explorer had plunged into the Columbia River? Search crews dragged sonar across the depths, but the gorge is merciless. Its channels are jagged, filled with silt and currents strong enough to swallow a vehicle whole. For 2 days, divers resurfaced empty-handed. The media swarmed. Evening news anchors opened broadcasts with "The Vanishing Matthews Family." Headlines screamed across Oregon and into national outlets. 5 missing in Christmas Eve mystery. Families at home, unwrapping gifts and carving turkeys, kept televisions tuned to the updates. Investigators faced 2 competing theories. The first was the simplest, an accident. The gorge was known for its treacherous stretches of road, especially in fog. It wasn't unthinkable that Richard had lost control, the Explorer skidding off the highway and into the freezing river below. But the second theory lingered, darker, harder to dismiss: foul play. If it were an accident, why hadn't the Explorer or any trace of the family been found, despite intensive searches? Why had Elaine's scarf been discovered far from the reported shoe, almost as if placed deliberately? And why did the gas station and café footage show Richard with a strangely tense, withdrawn demeanor, while Elaine and the children seemed perfectly normal? Detectives noted these details, but in the first 72 hours, time pressed too heavily for speculation. "Our priority is to find them alive. Every second counts," one investigator told the press. But seconds turned into hours, and hours into days. Christmas ended. The holiday lights that lined neighborhood streets twinkled against a backdrop of fear and disbelief. By the end of the third day, no car had been located, no bodies recovered, no answers given. What began as a family tradition had curdled into tragedy and suspicion. The Matthews disappearance was no longer a matter of lateness or bad luck. It was a case that, even in its infancy, carried the unmistakable weight of mystery. The question hanging over everyone was simple and chilling: accident or something far more deliberate?
By the fourth day, the absence of evidence became its own kind of evidence. With no car pulled from the river, no bodies recovered, and only a scattering of personal items found miles apart, investigators were left staring at a void. In that vacuum, rumors and suspicions poured in like floodwater. The first whispers centered on Elaine. It started quietly, with a coworker mentioning to police that Elaine had grown close to her boss at the small catering company where she worked part-time. Soon, the word affair was circulating both in the office and the Matthews neighborhood. Neighbors recalled tense glances between Richard and Elaine during PTA meetings, subtle arguments that may have been more than just ordinary marital friction. Could Elaine, disillusioned, have orchestrated a disappearance with her children? The theory gained traction when a clerk at a Hood River motel reported seeing a woman with 3 kids checking in late that Christmas Eve. But when detectives followed the lead, the description fell apart. The woman in question turned out to be a tourist from Seattle, traveling with her own children, another dead end. Yet the rumors clung stubbornly. By the end of the week, some in the community began whispering not about Elaine's victimhood, but about her potential guilt, that she might have fled her marriage, that she might have used the holiday drive as her escape route. Then came the second red herring. A truck driver on I-84 claimed he had seen another vehicle following closely behind the Matthews Explorer near Cascade Locks. He described it as a dark SUV, maybe a Chevy Suburban, its headlights cutting through the fog like predatory eyes. The report was chilling. Had someone pursued the family into the Gorge? Could it have been connected to the rumored affair or to something else in Richard's life? Detectives scrambled to track down the alleged SUV. For 2 days, they combed through toll booths, highway cameras, and witness statements. But the fog that night had rendered cameras useless, and no other credible witnesses confirmed the sighting. Without corroboration, the SUV joined the growing pile of speculative threads, unraveling, impossible to tie together. The third red herring was even stranger. An anonymous call came into the sheriff's office from a woman claiming Elaine had confided in her about debts Richard didn't know about. According to the caller, Elaine feared someone dangerous might come after her. But when detectives pressed for details, names, locations, proof, the caller refused to identify herself and hung up. The tip went nowhere. The sheer volume of theories overwhelmed investigators. Every rumor seemed to paint a different picture. Elaine as an unfaithful wife, Elaine as a runaway mother, Elaine as a woman stalked by shadowy figures. The narrative shifted constantly, leaving the public confused and the family's loved ones furious. Elaine's parents in particular were heartbroken at the insinuations. "My daughter would never leave her children," her mother told reporters, her voice trembling. "They loved them more than anything. These stories, they're cruel." The case was teetering on the edge of distortion. The only verifiable facts were the gas station footage, the café sighting, the abandoned scarf, and Sarah's shoe. Beyond that, every new lead dissolved under scrutiny. By the end of the second week, detectives held a press conference. Standing in front of cameras, the sheriff addressed the speculation. "There are many theories circulating. At this time, we have no evidence that Elaine left of her own will, nor that anyone in the family intended to disappear. We are investigating all possibilities, but we ask the community not to jump to conclusions." The plea did little to stop the rumor mill. For the Matthews loved ones, the constant swirl of gossip was its own kind of cruelty, erasing the image of a family that had once simply piled into their car for a holiday drive. What lingered most was not clarity, but confusion. Every lead seemed to collapse under its own weight. Every whispered suspicion led only into fog. And still,
The explorer remained missing, carrying with it the answers no one could find.
By the end of the first week, the Matthews family's disappearance was no longer just a local story. It was a regional obsession. The phrase splashed across the Oregonian front page on December 28th read in bold block letters, "Holiday family vanishes." Other outlets weren't far behind. Local TV anchors opened their broadcasts with the same chilling images. The grainy gas station tape, the family at the Hood River Café, Elaine's red scarf caught on a tree branch near the riverbank. The footage looped endlessly, turning the family's last known moments into a kind of ritualized haunting. In Portland, a candlelight vigil was held on Pioneer Courthouse Square. Hundreds gathered in the rain, huddling under umbrellas as carolers replaced Christmas hymns with somber renditions of Silent Night. People held up photographs of the three Matthews children, their gap-toothed smiles now frozen on missing posters, taped across lampposts, coffee shop windows, and school bulletin boards. Strangers embraced as if they'd known the family personally, united by a shared unease that something had gone terribly wrong. In Hood River, a second vigil took place near the river itself. Families lined the waterfront, releasing paper lanterns into the fog, their dim lights drifting upward like fragile souls trying to escape the darkness below. A local pastor's voice cracked as he prayed, "Bring them home, Lord, wherever they are." At the Matthews Children's Elementary School, the weight of loss was tangible. Classrooms became shrines, with classmates placing drawings, toys, and notes in empty desks. Counselors spoke to tearful students who asked questions no adult could answer. Was Rachel cold? Was Tommy hungry? Could they come back for Christmas next year? The innocence of their classmates was pierced, leaving teachers with the impossible task of both comforting and confronting. But the media had no such restraint. While vigils sought peace, the headlines sought spectacle. Speculation grew more dramatic by the day. One tabloid asked, "Cult sacrifice in the Gorge?" A true crime TV segment aired the theory of a wandering serial killer, complete with ominous recreations of headlights disappearing into mist. Talk radio callers spun conspiracies ranging from drug debts to secret government cover-ups. For locals, the saturation of theories bred both fear and paranoia. Mothers in Portland no longer let their children walk alone to school. Hikers avoided certain trails in the Columbia Gorge. The once picturesque fog that rolled in from the river each evening no longer felt romantic. It felt predatory, hiding unspeakable dangers. The Matthews extended family was caught in the middle of this storm. Richard's brother David pleaded at a press conference, "Please stop with the rumors. My family is gone. We just want the truth. We want them found." His voice cracked, and the camera zoomed in, capturing every tear. His grief became another headline, another clip fed into the endless loop of coverage. As the search stretched into the second week, pressure mounted on investigators. The sheriff's office was inundated with calls, some tips, many hoaxes, others wild speculation. Every day that passed without answers felt like another indictment on law enforcement, another signal to the community that maybe no one was safe. The Matthews case had become more than a disappearance. It was a mirror reflecting the community's deepest fears, that a family could vanish without a trace, that safety was only an illusion, and the darkness could swallow light in a single ordinary night. And yet, beneath the noise, the vigils, the headlines, the conspiracy theories, one thing remained painfully clear. The explorer, the bodies, and the truth were still missing. The questions hung heavier than the winter fog. By early 2005, the Matthews investigation had officially entered a word no family ever wants to hear: cold. After countless dives into the Columbia River, grid searches across forested terrain, and hundreds of tips pursued to dead ends, the official task force was scaled back.
Detectives rotated off the case, and boxes of evidence, Elaine's red scarf, tire impression photos, and binders of interviews, were sealed and shelved. The announcement was quiet, almost bureaucratic. A sheriff's spokesperson said only, "The investigation remains open, but we have exhausted current leads." For the Matthews family's relatives, those words were devastating. It felt less like closure and more like abandonment. Still, the absence of official progress didn't erase the family's presence from the public conscience. Each Christmas Eve, a small article appeared in the Oregonian, headlined with variations of "2 years later, Matthews' mystery still unsolved." By year 5, the articles grew shorter, tucked between holiday recipes and winter weather advisories. Yet even a few lines were enough to reignite the wound for those who had loved them. Privately, Richard's brother David and Elaine's sister Marjorie refused to let the tradition die. Each Christmas Eve, they gathered with a handful of relatives at the Columbia Gorge overlook, lighting candles and saying prayers in the freezing air. No cameras, no reporters, just silence broken by wind and the memory of voices long gone. "It's what they deserve," Marjorie once said, her candle trembling in her hand, "to be remembered." Meanwhile, the gorge itself grew into something larger than a geographic landmark. For many Oregonians, it became a symbol of the case's unyielding mystery. Hikers whispered that the cliffs hid answers the river refused to give up. Amateur sleuths in online forums dissected maps and sonar reports, claiming to know exactly where the explorer had sunk. To some, the gorge was sacred ground. To others, a haunted expanse swallowing truth whole. The detectives who had once pounded pavement carried the weight with them. One retired investigator admitted years later, "It never left me. You don't just forget 5 people vanishing, but sometimes you hit a wall so thick there's nowhere left to go." By the 10th anniversary in 2013, public memory had blurred. Other cases rose to prominence. Other headlines consumed attention. The Matthews family became one of many unsolved mysteries lingering in Oregon's history, a cautionary tale retold mostly in whispers. And yet, for those who lit candles every December, one question never faded. How could an entire family simply vanish into fog without the world ever giving them back? The silence of the Columbia Gorge seemed to hold the answer, but it would take 2 more decades before anyone dared to unlock it.
By 2020, nearly 2 decades had passed since the Matthews family vanished. For most, the case had settled into the category of unsolvable legend, a story that belonged to the Columbia Gorge as much as its cliffs and fog. But technology had evolved, and with it came a new generation of people unwilling to accept silence. Civilian dive teams, equipped with cutting-edge sonar, had begun sweeping rivers across the United States, solving cases once considered impossible. In the fall of that year, one such group brought their equipment to the Columbia River. Unlike the early 2000s, when divers relied on sight and touch in dark waters, the new sonar painted images with startling clarity, ghostly outlines of objects buried under decades of silt. On their 3rd day, a strange shape appeared on the monitor. Rectangular, metallic, unmistakably automotive. Divers dropped into the cold current, following the faint glow of their lights as they brushed away layers of mud. What emerged was the weathered skeleton of a Ford Explorer. Authorities were notified immediately, and a recovery operation began.
Crowds gathered along the riverbank as tow cables strained against the current. When the vehicle finally broke the surface, dripping mud and weeds, the sight drew gasps. The Explorer had been swallowed whole by the gorge, preserved like a time capsule of December 2003. Inside, the story revealed itself piece by piece. Bones lay in the back seat, small and fragile, fragments of a child's shoe beside them. In the front passenger seat, fabric clung to skeletal remains still buckled in. Forensic teams collected scraps of clothing, blue denim, a faded sweater, and carefully mapped the positions as if assembling a puzzle of lives once vibrant. One detail, however, sent a chill through the investigation. The driver's seat was empty. The belt hung loosely, unlatched. Every other occupant, Elaine and the 3 children, was accounted for in some form. But Richard Matthews, the father, was gone. The discovery reshaped everything. For years, the prevailing theory had been an accident. Fog, slick roads, a wrong turn into the river. But the empty driver's seat told a different story. Had Richard escaped? Had someone else been at the wheel? DNA testing confirmed the bones matched Elaine and the children. And then came the most disturbing revelation. Traces of blood preserved in rusted crevices of the Explorer's interior. Forensic analysis ruled it out as belonging to any of the Matthews family. It was someone else's, someone who had been in that car when it sank. The Columbia Gorge had finally given back its secret, but not the full truth. Instead, it handed investigators a darker mystery. If Richard wasn't in the car, then where had he been for the last 17 years? The confirmation came quietly at first. Elaine Matthews and her 3 children were indeed the remains pulled from the Ford Explorer. The DNA left no doubt, but the relief of answers was quickly shadowed by the darker fact. Richard Matthews, the father, was not in the vehicle. For detectives, this absence wasn't just a question mark, it was a red flag. Either Richard had been thrown clear in the crash and never recovered, or he had never been in the car when it plunged into the Columbia River. And if it was the latter, then where had he been for the last 17 years? The cold case unit began combing through records. A man couldn't simply vanish in the digital age, not forever. They checked death certificates, hospital admissions, and border crossings. But Richard Matthews left no trace after December 2003. It was as if the Gorge had swallowed him too. Then came the break. A forensic genealogist working alongside the detectives traced a partial DNA sample from the Explorer, the strange blood that wasn't Elaine's or the children's. The database didn't match a criminal offender, but it did link faintly to a living relative in Idaho. The more the team pulled at the thread, the more startling the tapestry became. In Boise, Idaho, a man named Michael Anders had been living quietly since the mid-2000s. He was a construction manager known for his punctuality, his firm handshake, his tendency to keep his private life private. Neighbors described him as dependable, maybe a little withdrawn. He attended barbecues, paid his bills, and even coached a youth baseball team for a season. When detectives cross-referenced his driver's license photo with the last known picture of Richard Matthews, the resemblance was undeniable. A little older, heavier, hair thinner, but it was him. The revelation was chilling. While the community of Portland had spent nearly 2 decades mourning the Matthews family, Richard had been hiding in plain sight, not in another country, not on the run, but in the very fabric of everyday American life. He had built something new, steady job, steady address, remarried under his new name. He had woven himself into another community that had no idea of the storm buried in his past. For the investigators, it was almost unthinkable. The man everyone assumed had died alongside his family had instead reinvented himself. The missing seatbelt in the Explorer was no accident. It was an omission, a gap that told the real story. Now the question shifted. Was Richard merely absent from the car, or was he the architect of the tragedy that put his wife and children at the bottom of the Columbia Gorge? The blood evidence suggested he had been there. The missing driver's seat occupant suggested he had walked away. And the life he had built in Idaho suggested he had never intended to come back. Detectives knew they couldn't move too quickly. If Richard sensed the walls closing in, he could vanish again, this time for good. They began assembling surveillance, laying the groundwork for what would become one of the most delicate and shocking covert operations the cold case unit had ever undertaken. Because Richard Matthews wasn't just a missing person anymore. He was the prime suspect.
Detectives knew Richard Matthews, now living as Michael Anders, was alive. They knew the Explorer held evidence pointing toward his guilt. What they didn't have was the smoking gun, DNA proof linking him to the crime scene. Without that, the whole case could collapse under the weight of speculation and defense attorneys. So they waited. Surveillance began quietly. A rotating team of investigators from Oregon and Idaho planted themselves in the rhythms of Richard's new life. They watched his modest home in Boise, a beige two-story with a trimmed lawn and a basketball hoop above the garage. They tailed him on his morning commute to the construction office where he worked as a manager. They noted his habits: coffee at the same shop near 7th Street, groceries on Sundays, evening walks with his new wife. To the neighbors, he was ordinary. To detectives, he was the ghost of a vanished family, living, breathing, unsuspecting. The team had one clear objective: collect an uncontaminated DNA sample without alerting Richard. No confrontation, no warrants yet. They needed it to hold up in court, and so every moment of his daily life became potential evidence. The break came on a gray Tuesday morning. Richard left his house at 6:45 a.m., jacket zipped, carrying a travel mug. But instead of using his reusable cup, he stopped at a corner café he rarely visited. He ordered a medium black coffee and walked out with the paper cup in hand. 2 investigators followed at a discreet distance as he sipped during his 15-minute drive to the office. He pulled into the lot, parked, and casually tossed the empty cup into a trash bin before heading inside. The team waited. Patience was everything. Once Richard was inside the building, an evidence technician, posing as a passerby, retrieved the cup. Gloves on, bag ready, the technician slid it into a sealed container. That discarded item, careless in Richard's eyes, was gold to the investigation. Back at the lab, tension ran high. The styrofoam cup carried faint traces of saliva. Swabs were prepared, the chain of custody meticulously logged. Analysts set the process in motion: extraction, amplification, comparison. The room was hushed, the whir of machines filling the silence. Meanwhile, the detectives who had spent weeks in the shadows waited in the hallway, replaying the years of dead ends, the silence from the gorge, the unanswered questions from grieving families. They knew what this result could mean. Hours later, the computer spat out the comparison. The alleles lined up, one by one. There was no ambiguity. The DNA from the discarded coffee cup matched the male DNA recovered from inside the Ford Explorer, the same DNA that didn't belong to Elaine or the children. It was Richard Matthews. The revelation hit like a thunderclap. The missing father wasn't a victim. He was present in the Explorer, leaving behind biological traces that tied him to the final moments of his family's life. And his survival, his reinvention under a new name, was no accident.
The lab analysts signed the confirmation with steady hands, but in the detective squad, the air was electric. 17 years of mystery had just crystallized into fact. The man who had been mourned, prayed for, even defended in community rumor, was now exposed as the prime suspect in the deaths of his wife and children. But they couldn't move rashly. This wasn't just about science, it was about timing. Arresting Richard too soon could allow him to slip through the cracks, especially if he suspected surveillance. The investigators tightened their strategy, coordinating with prosecutors. They wanted to wait for the precise moment to deliver the blow in a way Richard could not evade. For now, Richard Matthews still walked free, coaching baseball games, smiling at neighbors, living a lie. But in the cold case files of Oregon, he had already been unmasked. And when the moment came, the arrest wouldn't just shock a community. It would shatter the illusion of a man who thought he had buried his secrets under the Columbia River forever. The call from the lab came on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Detectives huddled around the speakerphone as the analyst's voice delivered the words they had been waiting nearly 2 decades to hear. DNA profile matches 100%. For a moment, silence reigned. The weight of those 5 words carried 17 years of grief, suspicion, and unanswered prayers. Richard Matthews, long presumed dead alongside his wife and 3 children, was alive and now scientifically tied to the crime scene inside the Ford Explorer submerged in the Columbia River. The decision was swift. Warrants were signed that night. A coordinated plan unfolded between Oregon state investigators and local Idaho authorities. Richard, now living as Michael Anders, would be arrested quietly at his Boise home without the chance to flee or destroy evidence. The morning of the arrest, the neighborhood was still waking up. School buses rolled past, dogs barked from fenced yards, sprinklers clicked across lawns. To the neighbors, Richard was the man who grilled on weekends, who shoveled snow from driveways, who brought coffee for co-workers. To detectives, he was a fugitive hiding in plain sight, a father who had slaughtered his own family and built a second life upon the ashes. Unmarked cars rolled into the cul-de-sac just after 7 a.m. Detectives in plain clothes walked toward the beige 2-story. A local officer rang the bell. Inside, Richard, gray at the temples, heavier than his 2003 photos, opened the door in sweatpants, coffee mug in hand. "Mr. Anders?" the officer asked. Richard hesitated, his eyes flickering for the briefest second. "Yes?" Detectives stepped forward. "Richard Matthews, you're under arrest for the murders of Elaine Matthews and your children, December 24th, 2003. The coffee mug slipped from his hand, shattering on the doorstep. The quiet cul-de-sac froze as officers moved in, cuffing the man who had been hiding in plain sight. His new wife, bewildered, appeared at the doorway in a robe, clutching the frame as if to steady herself. Neighbors emerged from porches, whispering, "What's happening?" Richard didn't resist. He didn't shout or plead. He bowed his head slightly, as though the years of pretending had finally come crashing down. News of the arrest broke within hours. In Oregon, the story that had haunted communities for nearly 2 decades erupted back into the spotlight. Headlines blared across national media. Father alive, arrested in 2003 Christmas Eve family murders. In Portland and Hood River, people who once believed the Matthews tragedy was a freak accident now struggled to reconcile the truth. This wasn't a family swept away by fog or river currents. This was betrayal at its most intimate. A husband, a father, turning on his own. At the Matthews children's old elementary school, teachers wept as they recalled Christmas plays the kids never got to finish. Candlelight vigils sprang up once again, this time in sorrow, mixed with outrage. Elaine's surviving relatives, who had clung for years to the faint hope that Richard might somehow have been an innocent victim, now faced the unthinkable. The man they had defended was no victim, he was the architect of their pain. Community trust shattered. For nearly 20 years, neighbors had prayed for Richard's soul, had placed his name on memorials. Now they learned he had been living, shopping for groceries, smiling for family photos, while his wife and children's remains lay at the bottom of the river. The arrest didn't just solve a mystery, it redefined it. What had once been seen as a tragic accident was now revealed as a deliberate act of betrayal from within. The Matthews family's disappearance was no longer a ghost story of fog and river currents. It was the story of a father who had chosen destruction over devotion, and a community left to reckon with the depth of that betrayal. And as Richard was transported back to Oregon to face the charges, the true unraveling was only beginning.
The room was plain, stripped of distractions. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above. A recording device sat on the table between Richard Matthews, still calling himself Michael Anders, and two detectives who had spent years studying his case. For the first 20 minutes, Richard said nothing. He kept his hands folded, his face carefully blank. He asked for water, leaned back in his chair, and repeated a single line, "You've got the wrong man." But detectives had been here before. They let the silence hang, letting Richard hear the sound of his own breathing. Then they pushed the first photograph across the table, the rusted Ford Explorer, dragged from the Columbia River after 17 years. Richard's eyes flickered. Next came the lab results, the DNA comparison, the discarded coffee cup, the printout with the words he couldn't refute. DNA profile matches 100%. The wall cracked. Richard shifted forward, his shoulders slumping, as if the weight of 2 decades finally bore down. "She was going to leave me," he muttered, almost to himself. Detectives leaned in. "Who?" His eyes reddened, his voice dropping to a growl. "Elaine. She was having an affair with her boss. Thought I didn't know. Thought she could humiliate me. I wasn't going to let her walk away with the kids and leave me in ruins." The confession spilled out in fragments, jagged and cold. He described the confrontation on Christmas Eve 2003. Elaine, in her red scarf, told him she was done, that she had someone else. Rage overtook him. He claimed he lost control, though the details painted a more calculated picture. He admitted forcing the family into the Explorer, driving them toward the gorge under cover of fog. He spoke of weighting the vehicle, slipping it into the river so it would sink, making it look like a tragic accident. Then, while Elaine and the children buckled in terror, he had staged the scene to leave no trace of himself. The detectives pressed. "But your seat was empty. Why?" Richard's answer chilled them. He had deliberately prepared forged papers weeks earlier. After sending the Explorer into the water, he swam to shore where a second vehicle was waiting, one he had stashed days before. He walked away into a new life while his family vanished beneath the current. The chilling detail that struck hardest was his mention of Elaine's scarf. Found tangled on a roadside branch, it had long been believed to be evidence of her attempt to escape. But Richard smirked as he admitted, "I left it there on purpose, a breadcrumb. Something to make you all think it was random, or maybe that she ran. I wanted you chasing shadows." The detectives exchanged glances. For years, that scarf had been a symbol of Elaine's last moments. To learn it was nothing but a calculated misdirection deepened the cruelty of Richard's act. As the hours stretched, Richard gave more than facts. He gave glimpses into a mind that had buried his family, then reinvented himself as though they had never existed. He admitted using forged identification to become Michael Anders, working menial jobs until he could climb back into a stable life. He remarried. He smiled in family photos, all while the community that once prayed for him kept his memory alive in candlelit vigils. Detectives asked if he ever felt guilt. His response was cold. "I survived. They would have ruined me. Better this way." The room fell silent. For the investigators who had carried the Matthews case for nearly 2 decades, this was no closure. It was a chilling validation of their darkest suspicions. Richard's confession confirmed what the evidence suggested. This was not a man who snapped in a moment of rage. This was a man who had calculated an escape, rewritten his identity, and watched the world mourn him while he built a second life. When the interrogation ended, detectives stepped into the hall, faces pale. They carried not just a confession, but the haunting realization that Richard Matthews had manipulated everyone, family, friends, neighbors, even strangers, for 20 years. And now, his secrets were out.
The phone call came on a gray March morning in 2020. DNA analysts confirmed what the Matthews relatives already knew in their hearts, but had resisted saying aloud. The remains pulled from the Explorer belonged to Elaine and the 3 children. The bones of an 11-year-old, an 8-year-old, and a 5-year-old laid together in the rear of the SUV still buckled into their seats. Elaine's skeletal frame was found in the passenger seat, fragments of her red scarf clinging to her collarbone. Forensic anthropologists carefully cataloged each fragment, each piece of fabric, each rusted clasp. The official report left no ambiguity. 4 of the Matthews family members had died on Christmas Eve 2003, not in a tragic accident, but as victims of Richard's betrayal. News of the confirmation swept through Portland and Hood River like a storm. The family's relatives, who had lived with a suspended grief for nearly 2 decades, finally had their answer. Elaine's sister wept openly outside the courthouse, telling reporters, "For 17 years we prayed for answers. Now we can finally bring them home." In April, a candlelight vigil was held in downtown Portland. Hundreds gathered, many clutching candles, some holding framed photos of the children in their school uniforms. Local churches rang their bells at 7:30 p.m., the time investigators believed the Explorer slipped beneath the Columbia River all those years ago. The names were read aloud: Elaine Matthews, Rachel Matthews, 11, Daniel Matthews, 8, and little Sophie Matthews, 5. Each name was met with silence, followed by the sound of muffled sobs. For those who had once searched the riverbanks, who had pinned missing posters to grocery store windows, who had tied yellow ribbons around trees every Christmas, the vigil was both closure and devastation. Closure because the truth had finally surfaced. Devastation because that truth carried a betrayal far more chilling than any stranger's violence. The community had mourned Richard Matthews for 17 years, holding him up as a father taken too soon, a victim alongside his family. Now every prayer, every vigil, every kind word spoken in his memory felt like it had been stolen. The betrayal cut especially deep for the Matthews children's school teachers and classmates. At the memorial, a teacher who once taught Rachel spoke through tears. "We always left an empty seat for her at the Christmas pageant, hoping she'd come back. Tonight, we know she never will." As the candlelight vigil flickered, the Columbia River seemed to take on new meaning. For 17 years, its fog and current had guarded the Matthews secret. Now it was both a grave and a witness, a reminder of what had been concealed beneath its waters. The family arranged for a private burial, laying Elaine and the children to rest together in Portland. The headstone bore a simple inscription: "Together, always." Richard's name, once etched in family obituaries and carved into the community's grief, was absent. Detectives who had worked the case attended quietly. Some had retired, their hair grayer, their shoulders heavier, but they stood in the back, watching as the community honored the victims. For them, this was not just another case closed, it was a promise kept. Even if it had taken nearly 2 decades, the Matthews family had finally been given back their names, their story, and their peace. But the closure was complicated. The knowledge that Richard had lived freely, built a second life, and even remarried left a bitter taste. The vigil became more than mourning. It became a statement. Signs appeared in the crowd. Justice for Elaine. Never again. The betrayal of trust had not just scarred the family, but the entire community. Still, as the final candle burned low, Elaine's sister spoke words that many needed to hear. She took everything from us that night, but tonight we take something back. We take back their memory, their dignity, and their place in our hearts. He cannot touch that. For the first time in 17 years, Christmas Eve no longer carried only mystery. It carried answers. And though grief would never leave, the Matthews family, at last, was no longer missing. They had been found.
The trial of Richard Matthews opened in the fall of 2022, nearly 19 years after the disappearance of his family. By the time he entered the courtroom, his name had already become a lightning rod across Oregon. To some, he was the embodiment of evil, a father who murdered his wife and children to satisfy rage and jealousy. To others, he was a ghost made flesh, a man who had been mourned for nearly 2 decades, only to reappear as the very villain of the story. The courtroom was packed on opening day. Journalists filled the benches, survivors of other code cases traveled in solidarity, and former classmates of Rachel, Daniel, and Sophie attended as adults, clutching faded school photos. Elaine's surviving family sat in the front row, their faces set like stone, unwilling to look at the man who had destroyed their world. The prosecution wasted no time framing Richard's crimes as deliberate, methodical, and rooted in jealousy. They described how in the weeks leading up to Christmas Eve 2003, Richard discovered Elaine's affair with her supervisor at a Portland insurance firm. Instead of confronting the betrayal openly, he began constructing an alternative life, gathering forged documents, quietly preparing to vanish. In his opening statement, the lead prosecutor's voice carried a chilling calm. This was not an accident. This was not a momentary lapse. This was a father who, faced with humiliation, chose annihilation. He executed his wife and children, staged a car accident, and disappeared into a new life while the people of Oregon prayed for him as a victim. That is not grief. That is calculation. The defense painted a different picture. They described Richard as a man overwhelmed by shame, a husband whose world collapsed upon discovering betrayal. His attorneys argued that his mental state was unstable, that his judgment had been clouded by despair and humiliation. He did not plan this for months, the defense claimed. He snapped, and in that moment of collapse, tragedy unfolded. But the evidence told another story. Forensic analysts testified that the explorer had been deliberately weighted with chains to sink into the river. Detectives presented proof that Richard had applied for new identity documents weeks before the murders. And perhaps most damning, prosecutors unveiled the red scarf, the anchor object of the case. A fragment of Elaine's scarf had been cut and left near the house, planted as a false lead. That small act of deception revealed intention, not impulse. The courtroom listened as witnesses recounted the years of grief. Elaine's sister broke down on the stand, describing the annual vigils, the unanswered prayers, the torment of not knowing. "We thought he was gone too," she cried, pointing toward Richard. "We lit candles for him. We spoke his name every Christmas, and the whole time he was alive. He was hiding." When Richard took the stand, the courtroom hushed. For the first time, the community heard his voice not as a missing father, not as a grieving victim, but as the accused murderer of his own family. His demeanor oscillated between defiance and hollow regret. He admitted to discovering Elaine's affair, admitted to snapping, but denied premeditation. "I just wanted it all to stop," he muttered, eyes cast downward. The prosecution dismantled his narrative in cross-examination. They reminded jurors of the meticulous planning, the forged identity, the weighted chains, the staged disappearance. Piece by piece, the facade of an impulsive crime crumbled. After 6 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than 2 days. On the afternoon of October 17, 2022, the foreman stood and delivered the verdict. Guilty on 4 counts of first-degree murder. The judge's sentencing remarks became the trial's closing chapter. His words were stern, almost trembling with moral weight. "Richard Matthews, you committed the ultimate betrayal. You extinguished the lives of your wife and 3 innocent children. You staged an illusion to make yourself appear a victim while your community wept for you. This court sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. May you live every day with the truth of what you have done." As the gavel fell, sobs echoed through the courtroom. Elaine's family clutched one another. Reporters rushed to file their breaking headlines. Cold case father convicted of family murders. For Oregon, the verdict closed one of its most haunting mysteries. But for those who had loved Elaine, Rachel, Daniel, and Sophie, justice came with a hollow aftertaste. No verdict could restore what was lost. Yet for the first time in 19 years, the Matthews family could finally rest, not missing, not forgotten, but remembered and vindicated.
In the wake of Richard Matthews' conviction, Portland and the wider Oregon community entered a strange season of healing. For nearly 2 decades, the Matthews family had existed as a painful question mark in the town's memory. An empty Christmas seat at dinner tables, a tragic headline replayed every holiday season, a name whispered with sorrow. Now the truth was out, but the truth itself was almost too heavy to bear. Elaine's surviving family members took the lead in transforming grief into legacy. Within months of the verdict, they announced the creation of the Matthews Family Memorial Scholarship, designed to support children in Oregon who had lost parents to violence or tragedy. At the launch event, Elaine's sister spoke through tears. Rachel, Daniel, and Sophie never got to grow up. They never got to finish school or follow their dreams. This fund will carry their names forward, ensuring that other children who also know loss get the chance our family never had. The scholarship became more than a symbol. It was a vessel of hope. Each year, applicants wrote essays not just about ambition, but about resilience. Teachers and counselors began referencing the Matthews family when speaking to students about perseverance and the power of memory. It was as though the community was determined to make sure this family's story did not end in silence, but in impact. Meanwhile, investigators and advocates pointed to the case as a lesson in the importance of persistence in cold case work. Forensic technology had advanced dramatically in the 2 decades since the SUV first disappeared into the Columbia Gorge. The sonar scan that uncovered the Explorer was something unimaginable in 2003, and the precision of DNA testing had reached levels that allowed detectives to connect discarded coffee cup DNA with traces buried under river silt. For law enforcement, this case became a rallying point. Never close the door. Never assume a mystery will remain buried. Science keeps moving forward, one detective told the press, and with it, truth finds a way to surface even after 20 years underwater. The broader community, however, wrestled with the emotional weight of betrayal. For years, neighbors and friends had lit candles for Richard Matthews, mourning him as a presumed victim. Now they realized he had been alive all along, living under a false name, blending into a new community,
starting over while his wife and children's remains lay submerged. In vigils held after the trial, some residents expressed anger at their misplaced sympathy. Others spoke of forgiveness, not for Richard, but for themselves, for having been fooled, for having carried sorrow that belonged to a lie. The scar remained, but so too did the reminder of resilience. People can endure nearly 2 decades of doubt and still emerge with a measure of justice. The Matthews case also underscored an unsettling truth. The greatest dangers sometimes come not from strangers, but from within. The story had begun with whispers about Elaine's boss, theories about stalkers and cults, suspicions of highway accidents. Few dared consider that the father, the man everyone trusted, was the very architect of tragedy. It was a reminder that appearances can mislead, that sometimes the most familiar face hides the darkest secrets. Yet, in the end, the community refused to let that betrayal define them. In Hood River and Portland, holiday vigils transformed into memorial events celebrating resilience. Local choirs sang the children's favorite carols. Neighbors carried lanterns down frosted streets, and families wrote messages on paper stars before hanging them on a tree planted in memory of the 3 children. The rituals became not just about mourning, but about reclaiming light from shadow. And so, 19 years after the headlights of the Matthews family's Ford Explorer vanished into the fog, their names were no longer bound only to mystery or betrayal. They were remembered through scholarships, songs, and memorials, through the act of keeping their memory alive. The lesson lingered like an echo across Oregon. Justice may come late, but justice can still come. Even in the face of betrayal, even in the silence of 2 decades, truth does not rot. It waits, quietly, persistently, until human hands and advancing tools bring it into the light. For those who followed the story, the Matthews case became more than a crime. It became a parable of endurance, a testament to the power of persistence, and a reminder of the fragility of trust within the home. And to you, listening now, there is one final thought. Stories like this matter because they preserve memory. They remind us that behind every headline are real families, real scars, and real lessons for the future. If this story moved you, share it. Keep the names of Elaine, Rachel, Daniel, and Sophie alive, not just as victims, but as people who deserved more, whose legacy is now being written through those who remember. Late justice is still justice, and in remembering, we ensure it never fades again.